In our previous film, In What Century Did Christ Live?, we talked about a sensational discovery made by Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky, the authors of the New Chronology Project. As a result of many years of deep research, scientists have established that the time of Jesus Christ's life on Earth shouldn't be considered the 1st century AD, but the 12th. This discovery entails not only a revision of the entire chronology of human life, but also the entire world history as a whole. Having studied hundreds of old documents, Fomenko and Nosovsky came to the conclusion that it is necessary to re-establish not only the dates of most historical events, but also their location. Traditional history assures us that, in general, all historical facts have long been verified and there is no need to prove their authenticity. But in reality, this is not always the case. For example, studying one of the most important documents in the history of mankind, the Bible, Fomenko and Nosovsky discovered that in the Old and New Testaments the name Jerusalem doesn't portray the modern Jerusalem, but a completely different city. We will talk about this in our film. Once upon a time there was a kingdom called the Kingdom of Judah. The capital of this kingdom was the city of Jerusalem. Modern historians and archaeologists claim that this kingdom was located in southwestern Asia, where the state of Israel is located today. The current capital of Israel is also called Jerusalem. Scholars who study biblical history claim that ancient Jewish Jerusalem and modern Jerusalem is the same city. But why are scientists sure that ancient Judah was located exactly here, on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea, and not somewhere else? Let's look at the facts. The capital of the State of Israel is honored as a sacred place by Christians, Muslims, and Jews. It is believed that it was here that the Temple of Solomon was built, Jesus Christ was crucified, and the Prophet Muhammad ascended to the heaven. Every year this city is visited by thousands of tourists and pilgrims. True, many are disappointed with what they see because it is very difficult to find genuine evidence of biblical history in modern Jerusalem. Even tourist guides frankly report that both the churches and the houses of the Old City were built much later than the events described in the Old and New Testaments. Plaques installed on some houses inform that, for example, this house was built in the 14th century, and this one in the 15th. And the main Christian shrine of Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, was built in fact in the 19th century.
This is most likely the beginning of the 19th century. This is the era of Napoleon, when for the first time Napoleon's troops entered these places, defeating the Turkish troops, defeating the Mamelukes in Egypt. For the first time, Europeans appeared in Palestine at the site of the village of Al-Quds. The church we see today was built in the 19th century. Then they said that, allegedly, there was a church earlier here but it had been destroyed. But what is here today? The Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is a building of the 19th century.
The Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is a building of the 19th century. In modern Jerusalem, it is impossible to find Mount Calvary or Golgotha. Today, Calvary is just a place where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre stands. There is no mountain here that would correspond to the gospel description of the place of the crucifixion of Christ. Anyone who carefully examines the so-called ancient part of Jerusalem will be convinced that there is nothing biblical here, except for the names. And even they returned here only in the 19th century with the arrival of European archaeologists. And this is not surprising. Few people know, but 200 years ago there was no Jerusalem at this very place. Here was a small Palestinian village of Al-Quds. So why are historians convinced that the ancient kingdom of Judah was located on the site of modern Israel? The main support of historians in the study of biblical antiquities is a science called biblical archaeology. Its main purpose is search and study of artifacts related to the events described in the Bible. Compared to other sciences, biblical archaeology is a fairly young discipline, only 200 years old. But nevertheless, archaeologists and historians believe that during this time enough evidence was found that it was precisely here, on the site of modern Israel, the kingdom of Judah was located in ancient times. But in fact, there is no indisputable evidence of this. The American scientist Edward Robinson was the first to study Palestine. He made 2 trips to this country in 1838 and 1852. It is generally accepted that already on his first visit, Robinson examined the walls of the ancient city, but it sounds at least strange.
The fact is that back in the 19th century it was clearly written in studies on the topography of Jerusalem, and references to these books can also be found in our books. These facts are well known that lines of the walls of Jerusalem are not defined. In the 19th century they did not even know yet where the walls of Jerusalem were. Archaeologist Conrad Schick specialized in this in particular. And Schick was one of the first who tried to find biblical names, biblical ruins, temples and holy places in the area. They did not succeed, and for a very long time a lengthy work was carried out to implant artificial biblical names on paper on the territory of Jerusalem.
And another famous archaeologist, George Wright, who has been excavating in Palestine for many years, frankly admitted that most of the finds made here prove absolutely nothing. Today, after 200 years, nothing has changed. Archaeologists have not found irrefutable evidence, but many pseudo-finds appeared, or, to put it simply, just fakes. For example, the so-called King Solomon's tablet of stone, allegedly miraculously found in a pile of garbage near the Temple Mount, or an ossuary, a stone box in which, allegedly, the remains of Jesus Christ's brother James were buried. This fake ossuary was on display in Canada at the Royal Ontario Museum. It was seen by 100,000 people, many of whom honored this find as a shrine. And only a few years later it turned out that it was a fake.
At the moment, there's a court case going on.
Now in the High Court of Jerusalem, a case is being heard about some of the finds, which may have been falsified. These include the ossuary of the Apostle James. For 5 hours I testified in this case in court. This ossuary does not inspire me with confidence. I think that part of the inscription was applied somewhat later. I have my own criterion for evaluating each find in situation. In this case, you can observe a huge disharmony. Therefore, I think that the inscription is not authentic.
And how many more such false biblical artifacts are kept in museums and in private collections?
I believe that many finds that have come under suspicion are indeed forgeries. I wrote an article about a group of fraudsters who in the late 60s and early 90s were engaged in forging seals in Jerusalem. I also have a garnet stone, which is exhibited in this museum. The garnet itself is an original find, and the inscription on it is a fake.
Probably, some of the archaeological finds made on the territory of modern Israel are really ancient. But if they prove nothing, as archaeologist Wright said, maybe the traces of ancient Jerusalem should be looked for elsewhere? So, for 200 years, scientists and archaeologists have not been able to find evidence that the kingdom of Judah was on the Mediterranean coast. But nevertheless, just like 2 centuries ago, nowadays historians insist that this ancient kingdom was located here. Why? Maybe old maps and manuscripts point to this. Or maybe this area matches the biblical description so well that it is simply impossible to make a mistake. But that's what is said about Judah in the biblical book of Deuteronomy. For the Lord thy God bringeth thee into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and depths that spring out of valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, and vines, and fig trees, and pomegranates, a land of oil, olive, and honey, a land wherein thou shalt eat bread without scarceness, thou shalt not lack anything in it, a land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills thou mayest dig brass. It is quite obvious that this description is very different from what can be seen today. The nature of ancient Judah is not at all like the nature of modern Israel. It is hard to imagine that once on this barren land there were wheat fields and vineyards, and water-abundant rivers flowed. And if all this really was here, then what happened? Why did the blooming land turn into a scorched desert? Some changes could occur due to natural or man-made disasters, but there is no evidence at the disposal of historians that cataclysms occurred in this area, as a result of which serious climatic or geophysical changes occurred. In fact, historians are well aware that in the city, which today is called Jerusalem, there never were streams of water, many springs and lakes. This city is located in the mountains. The nearest water artery is tens of kilometers away. Therefore, there have always been problems with water here. In general, it is strange that people chose such an unsuitable place for building a city. All known ancient cities were built near water, because full-flowing rivers and seas have always been used as natural transportation routes. In addition, it was possible to fish. And perhaps, only Jerusalem is an exception. It is located far from large sources of fresh water, and 50 kilometers from the sea. Although in many medieval paintings, Jerusalem is located near a wide river or strait. High hills overgrown with greenery, tall branch trees are clearly visible. And such an image of Jerusalem is typical of the Middle Ages. At that time, for some reason, artists did not depict Christ crucified in the desert. They probably just knew what the real Jerusalem looked like. But there are other interesting details in these pictures. For example, the people depicted near the cross are wearing warm coats and fur hats. Is this clothing suitable for the desert climate? Historians say that this is just a fantasy of medieval artists. Supposedly at that time it was customary to depict the gospel events in this way. However, the Bible also speaks of the fact that it was quite cold in Jerusalem. Here is a quote from the Ostrog Bible, the first book of Ezra. Then all the men of Judah and Benjamin gathered themselves together unto Jerusalem within 3 days. It was the 9th month, on the 20th day of the month. And all the people sat in front of the house of God, trembling both because of this matter, and from winter. People numerous, and the time is now snowy, and there is no possibility to stand outside. We have cited the Ostrog Bible because the words about frosty winter and snow have disappeared without a trace from pages of later editions of the Bible. But maybe there are other written sources that give precise indications of the location of Judea? Since Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky established that the era of Christ's life on earth is the 12th century AD, the medieval documents are of the greatest interest to us. It turns out that in the Middle Ages, educated people believed that Judea was in the very center of the world. Here is what the historian Leo the Deacon wrote in the 10th century, talking about the journey of the Byzantine Emperor Nicephorus II Phocas to Judea. He went to a happy country, to the center of the earth, also called Palestine, which, as the Holy Scripture says, flows with milk and honey. At that time, people called the center of the earth the middle of the world that they knew. This is how they depicted it, for example, on geographical maps. And Jerusalem has always been placed in the center of this world, the capital of Judah. This is clearly seen, for example, on the Hans Rust map of 1480. Of course, these maps are not yet perfect and look more like nice drawings than maps in the modern sense of the word. But for some reason, cartographers depicted Jerusalem in the center. In the Middle Ages, most people had a rather vague idea of where exactly the Holy City was located. Before the advent of the printing press, it was not possible to create a large number of monotypic geographical maps and books. It was only with the development of printing in the 15th century that the ideas about the world among different peoples became approximately the same. But even with the development of cartography, for most people, Jerusalem was far away and inaccessible. So maybe, calling Jerusalem the center of the world, people put into this concept not a geographical meaning, but a religious one? Probably, every Christian country or just a large Christian community wanted to have its own Jerusalem, which later became not only the religious, but also the political center of the state. If for some reason the religious center moved, the name Jerusalem moved with it as well. The authors of the new chronology Anatoly Fomenko and Nosovsky, having studied a huge number of medieval geographical maps and one of the most important documents in the history of mankind, the Bible, found that the New Testament under the name Jerusalem doesn't describe the modern Jerusalem in Israel but a completely different city. This is Yoros Castle, located on the Asian shore of the Bosporus. It is located about 30 kilometers from the old central part of modern Istanbul. Fomenko and Nosovsky discovered that next to this ancient city of Yoros is Mount Golgotha, the same famous mountain described in the Gospel, on which Jesus Christ was crucified. Today this mountain in Turkey is called Mount Yusha or Mount Beykoz. According to the Gospels, not far from Jerusalem was Mount Golgotha, the place of execution of Jesus Christ. When, in the 18th and 19th centuries, historians decided that ancient Jerusalem once stood on the site of the Palestinian village of Al-Quds, they naturally began to look for Mount Golgotha there as well. However, there were no mountains nearby that matched the description. As a result, a small hill, not much different from other hills, began to be passed off as Golgotha. But to the south of the Yoros Castle there is a mountain that really looks very much like Golgotha. This mountain is Yusha, the highest mountain on the upper Bosporus. Its height is 180 meters above sea level.
We found an old book by the Turkish historian Celal Asad, which describes ancient Constantinople. In this book, we came across circumstances that struck us, namely, that next to Istanbul, on its outskirts, in the suburbs, in fact, there is Mount Beykoz, on which there is an ancient grave called the Grave of Yusha. According to historians, it is considered the tomb of Joshua.
In ancient times, Joshua was the leader of the Jewish people, the successor of Moses. His deeds are described in one of the books of the Old Testament, which is called the Book of Joshua. However, why Joshua was buried here in Turkey, no one can explain, neither historians nor Muslim clerics. Moreover, the Turks themselves say that they know at least 3 more tombs of Joshua, in the city of Nablus, which today is part of the Palestinian autonomy, in Syria and in Gaziantep in southern Turkey. So, it is unlikely that this place can be treated as a real burial place of the biblical Joshua. But then what is it? Anatoly Fomenko and Nosovsky believe that this is not a grave, even a symbolic one, but the place of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Let's see what this place looks like. This is a flat rectangular earthen elevation 17 meters long and about 2 meters wide. It is surrounded by a high cast iron grate. Additional iron netting prevents numerous pilgrims from touching the holy ground inside the fence. Inside the fence is a piece of land overgrown with thick grass. Several high trees grow. At the opposite ends of the grave are 2 circular cylindrical stones, which are reminiscent of small millstones. In the center of one of them, a quadrangular opening and a very noticeable fissure can be seen. The whole structure is surrounded by a high stone wall, in which 2 doors and several windows have been made. The pilgrims enter one of the doors, pass around the grave in a circle and exit outside through a second door. And now let's see how Golgotha is described in the unique literary monument of the 12th century, the journey of the Daniel the Traveler. He made these notes during his pilgrimage to holy places. The first Russian pilgrim also visited Golgotha. This is how the monk described the place of the crucifixion of the Savior. The crucifixion of the Lord is on the east side on a stone. It was high above the spear. That stone was round, like a small hill, and in the middle of that stone, at the very top, a hole was carved about a cubit deep, and less than a span wide in circumference. Here the cross of the Lord was erected, and there is a cleft in that stone to this day. The crucifixion of the Lord and that holy stone are surrounded by a wall. There are 2 doors. And now let's look again how the tomb of Joshua looks like. Here is a tall round stone with a hole at the very top. It really looks like a small hill. Here is a pole or spear. And this is the second stone, on which the crack is clearly visible. A wall around the shrine and 2 doors. The match is just perfect. But why is this monument called a tomb? Because this area is too large for a real grave.
No need to think that there is a real grave of someone on the top of Bacchus, Yeshua, Jesus, Joshua, or Hercules. This is a symbolic grave, surrounded by bars. The actual scene of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. He was not buried there. This is a holy place for Christians, for believers, that they decided to keep. 2 stones were placed there. A stone marking the place where the cross was erected. Next to it is a pole with a golden disc, a symbol of a spear. The second stone marks the place where they laid the body of Jesus Christ taken down from the cross. And it's all. This is a symbolic grave, not a real burial.
But that is not all. According to local residents, at the foot of Mount Yusha there are 3 more huge graves about 7 to 8 meters long.
Perhaps these are the symbolic graves of the apostles of Jesus Christ, of which there were 12. Most likely the apostles themselves were not buried there, but the main grave, the main sanctuary of Jesus Christ with the crucifixion, could then be encircled and the symbolic graves of his apostles could have been placed around.
There is another important argument that Mount Yusha was the place of the crucifixion of Christ. In many ancient paintings, icons and frescoes, the crucifixion is shown either against the background of a large sea strait, or against the backdrop of a wide river. Moreover, the artists did not draw the sea, but the strait or the river, that is, they always showed the opposite shore. There is nothing like it in modern Jerusalem, but there are mountains in the vicinity of Mount Yusha, because it is located just on the Asian shore of the wide Bosporus, and from there the opposite European shore of the strait is perfectly visible. The discovery of Golgotha was the first important discovery made by Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky in this ancient land. In the future, Mount Bacchus played an important role in the search for Jerusalem. It was from here that the authors of the new chronology first saw the ruins of ancient Euros. Traditional history claims that Constantinople, today's Istanbul, was built in the 4th century AD. But according to the research of Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky, here on the European shore of the Bosporus, this city appeared no earlier than the 14th century AD. And if we ignore the chronology imposed on us back in school, then it looks quite logical. Let's see how Istanbul is located. The city stands at the confluence of the Bosporus into the Sea of Marmara. This place is ideal for the passage of ships to the Black Sea and back, their own ships. And so that other people's ships could not do this, guns were needed that could shoot far and ships with a deep draft for sailing on the high seas were needed. But they appeared only in the 14th century. Without them, it was impossible to control the Bosporus, and consequently, the construction of the city in such a place was simply pointless. It would be much more convenient to build it near those places where the strait narrows. This would give complete control over the strait. There are two such places on the Bosporus. This is where Constantinople is located. Here the width of the strait is 700 meters, and here it is 900. Here, on the Asian shore of the Bosporus, another medieval city of Yoros was built, which appeared here several centuries earlier than Constantinople.
We knew nothing about Yoros. Moreover, in our previous works, we believed that initially Jerusalem was in the place where Istanbul, Tsargrad is now located. True, we were confused by one circumstance. The fact is that, in the Gospels, when describing the procession of Christ from Jerusalem to Golgotha, that is, as we now understand, to Mount Bacchus, nothing is said about crossing a large water barrier or a large river, which is the Bosporus. This is a serious water barrier. Moreover, after all, walking from Istanbul to Bacchus is a long way. Even if you cross the Bosporus, it is still about 25 to 30 kilometers. Therefore, we had a certain feeling of dissatisfaction. Although we understood that in general, the old Jerusalem was here, but we did not know the exact place back then.
Research continued, and after a while Nosovsky arrived here. Here on Mount Yusha he saw a curious reproduction of an old engraving. The reproduction depicts Mount Yusha, and some old city is visible on a high hill in the distance. Nosovsky decided to see what is now on that hill. According to the research of the authors of the New Chronology, this place was well suited for the location of ancient Jerusalem. But what the scientists saw exceeded all expectations.
We couldn't even imagine that the name of Yaros is just like that, openly written. We thought that there could be some ruins. Somehow it would be necessary to prove and look for some arguments. And maybe it's not Jerusalem. Maybe we just think. We didn't have confidence. But when we saw such a transparent name, and then everything fell into place.
So, it turns out that evidence of the Christ's life on earth, which archaeologists have searched in vain in Palestine, is found in Turkey, near Istanbul, and Mount Yusha is the biblical Golgotha. Unlike Constantinople, Yoros has not survived to this day. This is a ruined city. Its ruins are located on a high hill at the confluence of the Bosporus and the Black Sea. Historians do not have an unambiguous opinion about the date of construction of the fortress. Someone believes that the fortress existed in the pre-Byzantine period, and someone suggests that Yoros was built in the 12th century to protect Constantinople from Viking raids. The fact that in ancient times this city was called Jerusalem is quite obvious. After all, the very word Yoros or Hieros, as the Greeks called the fortress, is nothing more than an abbreviated name for Jerusalem. Until the 17th century, not only Greeks but also Russians pronounced and wrote Jerusalem with O, that is, Jerusalem. This word is also written in Latin, Hierosolyma. In Russian, they began to write and pronounce Jerusalem with U, only in the 17th century after the church reform of Patriarch Nikon of Moscow. Most likely it was this city that was the first capital of the Byzantine Empire, which in the Middle Ages was called the Kingdom of Judah, and the city itself was called Hieros in Greek, and Hierosolim in Russian. And about 300 years later, the Byzantine Empire decided to build a new capital.
When this move was made, the place of Old Jerusalem, that is, the Yaros castle at the northern end of the Bosporus, was no longer suitable for the capital, because there were no piers for large ships. By that time, there were already quite large ships. At that time, guns had already appeared. This means that more powerful fortifications of the city were needed. The place itself, where Yaros is located, is not very spacious. It is quite limited space. But for the end of the 14th century, this place was already uncomfortable.
Thus, Constantinople appeared on the opposite bank of the Bosporus. From Yoros, it got not only the functions of the capital, but also the name Jerusalem. Fomenko and Nosovsky believe that the events described in the Gospel took place in Yoros. Somewhere here in 1185 Jesus Christ was crucified. Let's see if we can find real confirmation of this event. If the biblical Jerusalem really was on the banks of the Bosporus, then it is the Bosporus that is described in the Bible as the Jordan River. By the way, until now, the Bosporus is sometimes called a river and not a strait. From the Bible it is known that the Jordan River flowed from north to south, from one sea to another. It divided the space of ancient history into the western and eastern shores. Moreover, from the biblical description it is clear that the western shore differs sharply from the eastern. It is on the western shore that the promised land is located, in which milk and honey flow. This description fits well with the Bosporus. It flows from the Black Sea to the Sea of Marmara and separates two climatic zones. Its eastern coast is rocky, hot and dry Asia Minor. Its other coast, the European one, is the Balkans with mountains and forests, and full-flowing rivers. From the farmer and cattle breeder's point of view, this is truly a paradise land. The Jordan River in modern Israel does not fit the biblical description at all. It originates not in the sea, but in the Golan Heights, and flows into the Dead Sea, which in fact has always been a lake. The modern Jordan River does not divide the country into two climatic zones. Israel is on one side, Jordan is on the other. The climate of both these countries is completely different from the description of the Promised Land. Jordan is mentioned dozens of times in the Bible. In many biblical stories it plays a very important, sometimes even key role. From the biblical text it is clear that it was not so easy to cross this river. Moreover, the text mentions special crossings over the Jordan, for which they had to fight with weapons in their hands. For example, we read the text of the first book of Maccabees. With that they joined battle, and Jonathan stretched forth his hand to smite backchides, but he turned back from him. Then Jonathan and they that were with him leapt into Jordan, and swam over unto the other bank, howbeit the other passed not over Jordan unto them. So there were slain of Bachid's side that day about 1,000 men. It clearly states that Jonathan's men swam across the river, and not crossed it. The warriors of Bachchides did not dare to swim to catch up with their enemy, although he inflicted huge damage on them. They lost 1,000 people. It turns out that the ownership of the crossings on the Jordan was a matter of life and death. The one who managed to cross was saved from the enemy. The Bible mentions two such strategic crossings over the Jordan, but it is rather absurd to assume that the biblical texts are talking about a flat stream, which today is called the Jordan River. It is difficult to call it a full-flowing river. It flows over exactly the same landscape for 250 kilometers, and its width at its widest point is only 40 meters, and in narrower places it can be easily crossed. The depth of water here will be no more than knee-deep. But the Bosporus perfectly matches the biblical description. Looking at it, you are not surprised that not everyone dares to cross this strait even in the narrowest place, which is about 700 meters. The Bible also says that ships were used to cross the Jordan. Here, for example, is a quote from the second book of Samuel. And there went over a ferry boat to carry over the king's household, and to do what he thought good. And Shimei the son of Gera fell down before the king, as he was come over Jordan. And again, looking at the Jordan River separating Israel and Jordan, it is difficult to imagine that ships could sail along this shallow river. But this cannot be said about the Bosporus, which can only be traveled by ship. Also important in the Bible is the story of the miraculous crossing of the Jordan. This is how it is described in the book of Joshua. That the waters which came down from above stood and rose up upon an heap very far. And the priests that bare the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firm on dry ground in the midst of Jordan. And all the Israelites passed over on dry ground, until all the people were passed clean over Jordan. It seems that the author of the biblical text, saying that the water stood and rose up upon an heap, thus described ice, that is, a frozen river. But in the entire history of meteorological observations, the temperature in the area of the modern Jordan has never dropped so low that this river could freeze. But the Bosphorus froze repeatedly. Byzantine, Arabic and Western European chronicles have preserved a lot of evidence that the Bosphorus, the Dardanelles, and most of the Black Sea were frozen. Moreover, these were not light frosts, but severe frosts. The ice was so thick that the sea, as eyewitnesses wrote, took the form of land. Therefore, it is not surprising that the priests stood in the middle of the Jordan as if on dry ground. Further, the book of Joshua says, "Then Joshua called the 12 men, whom he had prepared of the children of Israel, out of every tribe a man. And Joshua said unto them, Pass over before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of Jordan, and take ye up every man of you a stone upon his shoulder, according unto the number of the tribes of the children of Israel, that this may be a sign among you." What stones are we talking about here? Let's look at the Bosphorus again. 200 meters from the Asian shore, opposite the city center, there is a small island in the middle of the strait. The so-called Maiden's Tower is located on it. According to legend, there once stood a chapel in honor of the baptism of the Savior, and a cross was erected. Probably it was from this holy place in the middle of the river that the priests took those 12 stones as a memory of the harsh winter and the frozen Bosphorus Jordan. So, the geographical location and nature of these lands almost completely correspond to the biblical description of Judea and Jerusalem. Are there any ancient monuments here that can serve as material confirmation of the version of Fomenko and Nosovsky? The authors of the New Chronology believe that there are such monuments here. In the heart of the Turkish capital is the majestic Hagia Sophia. Historians claim that it was allegedly built in the 6th century AD under the Emperor Justinian. Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky identify this cathedral with the famous Solomon's Temple, built in ancient Jerusalem.
Where did the idea to identify the Temple of Solomon with the Temple of Hagia Sophia come from? The path was quite difficult and logical. It was based on our study of ancient dynasties using the methods of mathematics, statistics. We found that the history of the kings Saul, Solomon and David partially overlapped with the history of Byzantium in the 6th century AD, that is, the era of Justinian. A simple thought arose. Is the Temple of Sophia the Temple of Solomon? Later on, examining the material in more detail, we found a lot of evidence for this. In particular, having studied the history of the Sophia Cathedral, it turned out that the Temple of Sophia was built, not in the 6th century AD, but much later, in the 16th century, 1,000 years later.
The construction of the Temple of Solomon in the 16th century fits well into the chronological version of Fomenko and Nosovsky. The temple was built after moving the capital from the old Jerusalem Euros to the new Jerusalem Constantinople. Indeed, upon careful examination of the structure, it becomes obvious that it was built in the 14th century AD, the earliest. To begin with, the cathedral shows no signs of settlement. All buildings, especially such huge ones as St. Sophia Cathedral, eventually sink into the ground. So that the walls of old buildings do not collapse, they must be dug round, and door and window openings should be overlaid and lifted up. The walls of the cathedral are covered with plaster, but in those places where it is absent, it is clearly seen that there are no traces of relaying. Why didn't the building, allegedly built in the 6th century, sink at least a meter into the ground? Historians say that the ancient builders made a good foundation. For example, Turkish historian Celal Esad wrote that St. Sophia Cathedral was built on a square base, each side of which is 75 meters. Foundations are laid on a network of vaults, which are covered with a layer of homogeneous concrete 25 feet thick. It's almost 8 meters. Indeed, on such a foundation, even such a majestic building as the Hagia Sophia can avoid settlement. Today, the edges of this concrete foundation can be seen in the excavation at the entrance to the cathedral. But could builders of the 6th century really have made such a powerful concrete foundation? And one more interesting fact. In the 16th century, to strengthen the cathedral, brick extensions were made around it.
What was their problem? The fact is that the dome, such a huge dome, was built for the first time, and therefore it began to put too much pressure on these vaults, and began to crush the building. Because of this, the so-called flying buttresses had to be attached. That is, such brick extends that did not allow the dome to crush the box on which it stands. It is clear that these buttresses should have been attached immediately, well, a few decades later after the start of construction, but no more than that. Because if, as they say, this building has stood for 1,000 years without buttresses, then it is strong enough to hold such a dome. If it withstood it for 1,000 years, and during earthquakes, several earthquakes, it kept it, why in the 16th century, when there were no earthquakes, attach buttresses?
The entire old part of Istanbul is literally built up with huge mosques, the size and architecture of which are very reminiscent of St. Sophia Cathedral. But they are all built in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. If you believe the traditional history, it turns out that the Byzantine builders, who managed to build such a majestic building already in the 6th century, did not use their unique experience, and no longer built a single similar structure. And only 1,000 years later, buildings similar to the Hagia Sophia began to appear in Constantinople. At the very least, this is strange, because people immediately tried to put into practice all the new achievements in any field of human knowledge. Why wait 1,000 years if the experience was successful? Only one question remains: why did the Ottoman Turks, being Muslims, build such a majestic Christian temple? After all, as you know, Hagia Sophia was originally Christian. The answer to this question is given by the new chronology. According to the studies of Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky, the religious division between Orthodoxy and Islam began only in the 15th century AD, and finally ended only in the 17th. Therefore, it is not surprising that in the 16th century a Christian cathedral was built in Constantinople, Jerusalem. But if Hagia Sophia is really the Temple of Solomon, then somewhere nearby there must be a building that belonged to this temple. The Bible says that Hiram, the builder of Solomon's temple, built near the temple a molten sea, a grandiose structure filled with water. Is there such a building near the Hagia Sophia? Opposite the cathedral is one of the oldest monuments of Istanbul, the Basilica Cistern. In ancient times, there was little natural fresh water in Constantinople, so an aqueduct had to be built through which fresh water came from the Belgrade Forest, located 19 kilometers from the city. This water was stored in underground reservoir in case the city was besieged during the war. The very name of this building, the Basilica Cistern, means the reservoir of the temple, because the Hagia Sophia is a basilica in its design. A characteristic feature of the molten sea is that this reservoir for water was not dug into the ground, as is usually done, but was installed on some 12 brazen oxen. At first glance, it seems that this is just some kind of metaphor, but let's see how the cistern is built. The vaults of this structure are supported by 336 columns, which stand in 12 rows. These 12 rows are probably the 12 oxen. Why in the Bible the columns are called oxen? Today it is impossible to say unequivocally. For example, in Russian construction terminology, arches that support the vaults of bridges are still called bulls. An interesting story about the Jerusalem cistern was told by Josephus Flavius in his book Antiquities of the Jews. When God sent a snow, there was a lion who slipped and fell into a certain pit, and because the pit's mouth was narrow, it was evident he would perish, being enclosed with the snow. So when he saw no way to get out and save himself, he roared. When Benaiah heard the wild beast, he went towards him, and coming at the noise he made, he went down into the mouth of the pit, and smote him, as he struggled, with the stake that lay there, and immediately slew him. From this story it is clear that we are talking about large underground reservoir. And the story of Flavius is interesting because it describes a snowy winter in Jerusalem. This is further evidence that it was quite cold in Jerusalem in winter. There are other ancient monuments in Istanbul that witness the true history of this region. One of them is the Galata Tower. The height of the tower is 61 meters, the diameter is 9 meters, the height above sea level is 140 meters. It can be seen from almost all points of the central part of the city. The tower was built in the 14th century and was called the Tower of Christ. The Galata Tower received its second name from the name of the area Galata, where it is located. Today Galata is one of the districts of Istanbul. In the Middle Ages it was a suburb of Constantinople. Residents of the central part of the Byzantine capital called the inhabitants of this suburb Galatians. Historians are well aware of this word. They called the Galatians the people who settled in the territory of modern Turkey, allegedly even before the emergence of the Byzantine Empire. But for some reason, historians do not connect the ancient settlers with the inhabitants of medieval Galata, but perhaps these are the very Galatians to whom the famous Epistle to the Galatians of the St. Paul the Apostle was addressed. And if this is true, then it turns out that in one of his epistles, Paul directly says that Christ was crucified somewhere here in front of the inhabitants of Galata. This is how his words sound in the Russian Synodal Bible. O foolish Galatians, who deceived you not to obey the truth, you, who had Jesus Christ predestined before their eyes, as if crucified among you? In this phrase, the word predestined is the Russian translation of the Greek word proorgraphy, but it also has another translation. For example, Bibles written in Greek and other European languages retained a more precise meaning of the word proorgraphy, clearly portrayed. Moreover, in the Russian translation to the phrase, crucified among you, added words as if, so the meaning of this phrase of the Apostle Paul was changed. Now he was addressing not to the eyewitnesses of the execution of Jesus, but to people who, as it were, could imagine it. Interestingly, it was here in Galata that the Church of St. Paul was built at the beginning of the 13th century. Historians may object. It is not at all necessary that the Galatians to whom the Apostle Paul addressed were residents of the town of Galata. The Galatians lived not only there, but also on the Dardanelles and in the northwestern Black Sea region. This is true, but the Galatians never lived in Palestine. In our film, we repeatedly quoted the Bible. As you know, the Eternal Book has several translations from the Hebrew language. There is a Russian Synodal translation, there is a Latin Bible, there is an Anglican one. Basically, these texts are the same, but there are details in which they differ. Let's go back to the biblical text. In the book of the prophet Obadiah, which speaks of the migration of the children of Israel from Jerusalem, in verse 20 there is the word, Besepharad. In Russian translation, this word is translated as, in Sepharad, and the captivity of this host of the children of Israel shall possess that of the Canaanites, even unto Zarephath, and the captivity of Jerusalem, which is in Sepharad, shall possess the cities of the south. And in the Latin Bible, Vulgate, and some Bibles in English, the word Besepharad is translated not in Sepharad, but on the Bosporus, in Bosphoro. Here is the text. It says in black and white, Jerusalem on the Bosporus. The fact that ancient Jerusalem was indeed on the Bosporus explains many of the contradictions in traditional history. For example, it becomes clear why the Crusaders, who went to conquer Jerusalem and Palestine, instead ended up in Byzantium and captured Constantinople.
The Crusaders, going to liberate the tomb of the Lord, went to Tsargrad, to Constantinople. This was, in general, the main goal of the Crusades. Today the explanation is that, allegedly, later they went to Palestine, where they fought for the tomb of the Lord. However, nevertheless, old documents, old engravings show that the goal of the Crusaders was precisely Constantinople, Istanbul on the Bosporus. As we understand, this is quite true. The Crusaders knew perfectly well where the Gospel Jerusalem was located, that it was Tsargrad on the Bosporus. Of course, there was no Palestine, no village of Al-Quds in their times.
The studies of Fomenko and Nosovsky show how illogical another statement of historians looks that the Crusades began only 1,000 years after the crucifixion of Christ. In our previous film, In What Century Did Christ Live?, we talked about the fact that Christ was born in 1152 and was crucified in 1185 AD. Consequently, the Crusades took place literally in the wake of recent events. Moreover, in reality there were not 4 crusades, as historians say, but 2, in 1189 and 1204.
Ancient documents from the era of the Crusaders claim that the Crusaders, when they went on their campaigns, went to punish and execute the executioners of Christ. From which it follows, in any sound understanding of this text that, according to the Crusaders, the crucifixion of Christ took place in their time. They went to execute the still living executioners of the saint. Of course, historians today interpret these testimonies as some associations, some memories, some analogies. Because, according to modern historians, 1,000 years elapsed between the crucifixion of Christ and the era of the Crusaders.
In this film we have not told about all the facts discovered by Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky in the study of biblical history. But even these examples show that the history of ancient Jerusalem is greatly distorted, as well as the entire ancient and medieval history of mankind. But today we can say with confidence that the time of Christ's life on earth and the location of Jerusalem and Euros are ideally connected with each other and with other events in world history, which we will tell about in our next films. According to biblical texts, Jerusalem was destroyed by the troops of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, and then rebuilt. But nowhere in the Bible does it say that Jerusalem was built on the same spot. The authors of the New Chronology found out where Jerusalem, described in the biblical book of Nehemiah, was actually built. Our next film, The Moscow Kremlin, will tell about it.